In my role as director of the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, I have the privilege of welcoming you to the Howard Jay Reiter Memorial Lecture Series, which is now in its 4th year. I want to begin by expressing my sincere thanks to the leadership and staff of the Perry Woldhouse, especially Marie Harf, its executive director, my former student, for giving us a way to share tonight's speaker with the university community. We are exceedingly grateful for the Perry Woldhouse's partnership. In a few minutes, I will be asking my distinguished colleague, Professor Ben Nathans, to introduce our speaker, but please bear with me for a few minutes as I speak about the Howard Jay Reiter program itself and remember the person whose memory it was meant to honor. Howard Jay Reiter, a beloved member of the Katz Center's advisory board, passed away on September 4th, 2021, and his absence continues to be felt keenly by all who had the opportunity to know him. Howard was as brilliant as he was vibrant. Educated at Princeton University and at MIT with degrees in mechanical and aerospace engineering, he was an inventor of a multitude of United States and foreign patents, as well as a highly successful entrepreneur. What the Katz Center is trying to pay tribute to with this program is his deep humanity, which encompassed incredible inventiveness, but also optimism, a philanthropic spirit that led him to support many causes, including the Katz Center, and an inexhaustible curiosity about the world. This lecture series was established by Howard's family and friends as a way of honoring his support of scholarship, of the Katz Center, and of his lifelong relationship to Israel and the people of Israel. And we are deeply grateful to the family and friends of Howard for choosing to remember him in this way. Howard's wife, Jody, is with us this evening, along with other family and friends, and we thank them all for being present with us. When we first conceived the Reiter program, we did not intend for it to address current events, but rather to give the Penn community an opportunity to learn about Israeli society and culture and Israeli scholarship. That remains our goal, but those who have attended earlier Reiter programs know that we have not been able to escape present-day circumstances. An extremely difficult and trying 4 years that includes the nightmare of October 7th itself, along with war, political strife, protests, death, destruction, and so much heartbreak. Despite the ceasefire in Gaza that's ongoing right now, the way forward is not clear and the darkness continues. But this year's program is meant as a beacon of light and hope, drawing on the insights of a wonderful scholar and human being who was forced into the very center of the maelstrom, and yet who never gave up on bridge building, peace, or on humanity. We are very grateful that the Reiter program has given us a way to bring such a person to our community and to learn from him. So I asked Professor Ben Nathans to introduce our speaker because he has known him for a long time, and it was actually his encouragement in big part that motivated us, the idea for us to invite our speaker to Penn. Ben's recent Pulitzer Prize for his own scholarship had nothing to do with our turning to him, but I would note that the book that garnered that prize, a study of a group of people who never gave up hope in the face of darkness, feels very relevant to our topic today. And so I'm all the more grateful to Ben that he's going to introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you, Ben.
Good evening, everybody. It's an honor to be here to introduce our guest tonight, and I'm delighted to see such a strong turnout for this event. Jonathan Dekel-Chen is the Rabbi Edward Sandro Chair in Soviet and East European Jewry at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he holds a dual appointment in the Department of Jewish History and the Department of General History. He's also the academic chairman of the Leonid Nevzlin Research Center for Russian and East European Jewry. Dekel-Chen's research deals with modern Jewish history, modern Israel, transnational philanthropy and advocacy, non-state diplomacy, agrarian history, and migration. He made his name in the scholarly world with his first book called Farming the Red Land, Jewish Agricultural Colonization and Local Soviet Power, 1924 to 1941, which came out with Yale University Press in 2005. But I may as well say it right up front, he's not going to deliver a conventional academic talk this evening, and in that spirit, I'm not going to give him a conventional academic introduction. Because unlike most academics, and certainly most academics I know, whether in Israel or the United States, Jonathan lives his topics. He embodies them. He didn't just study the history of Jewish agriculture, he became a farmer himself, a member of Kibbutz Nir Oz in the south of Israel, less than a mile from Gaza. Like many academics, Jonathan is interested in issues of social justice. Unlike many academics, he took it upon himself to found a music school for underprivileged young Israelis. Together with his sons Sagui and Itai and the late Tamar Kedem Simantov, in 2014, Jonathan co-founded the Bikurim Youth Village for the Arts in Eshkol, not far from Kibbutz Nir Oz. Bikurim provides world-class artistic training for underserved high school students from throughout Israel. As many people, I think, in this room know, Kibbutz Nir Oz, where I had the pleasure of being hosted by Jonathan and his family in 2019, recently became very famous for some very horrible reasons. The Hamas attack on this and other kibbutzim on October 7th, 2023, resulted in the murder of dozens of its members, the captivity of many dozens more, as well as the physical annihilation and looting of Nir Oz. Jonathan's 37-year-old son, Sagui, at the time a father of 2, shortly thereafter a father of 3 young girls, was among the hostages taken that day. He was released in February of 2025, thanks not least to the intensive lobbying campaign by Jonathan and other relatives of the hostages. In the 2 years following the Hamas attack on his kibbutz, Jonathan was a tireless advocate in the US and Israel for the release of the hostages, including many meetings with senior officials of both the Biden and Trump administrations, as well as members of the US Congress. He also made hundreds of media appearances to inform the public about the plight of the hostages. I watched from considerable distance this lobbying campaign, his appearances in the media, the op-ed essays that he wrote. And I have to say, I was in awe of the stamina and the seemingly unshakable faith, which I confess I did not share, that his son would come home alive. It struck me then, and it strikes me now as almost superhuman, the qualities that he brought to that campaign. I knew from his earlier work that he was not an ordinary scholar and that he lived what he wrote and thought about. But neither I nor I think anyone else could imagine how that persona would find expression during these 2 truly nightmarish years, a little bit more than 2. So, ladies and gentlemen, the person that we are welcoming to Penn this evening is no ordinary scholar, and his talk will be no ordinary scholarly presentation. Please join me in a warm welcome for Jonathan Dekel-Chen.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks very much to my old friend, Ben Nathans, for very kind words. Also to the Katz Center and Steve Weitzman for inviting me to come speak with you, and to Marie Clark and the staff of the Perry World House for making it so comfortable to be here with you this evening. It's true, this will not be a conventional talk of a scholar of any standing. And I guess I'll open with a statement that I don't think you'd hear otherwise, is that I'd rather not be here. I'd rather not be here for the simple reason that I am here in the shadow of the worst tragedy in Israel's history, and by far the worst, certainly year and a half or 2 in my life, in my family's life, and in my community's life. What I'll try to do this evening is to make sense It's a first attempt on my part to make sense in a more scholarly way of the intersection of things that I had been studying, researching, publishing on for the last 20 years, and what happened as of October 7th moving forward. And on that day, October 7th, 2023, my world it changed forever. As you probably know, and Ben has mentioned, my son was amongst the approximately 250 Israelis, mostly Israelis, some foreign nationals, that were taken hostage on that day by Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, and other criminal gangs. My home for the better part of 45 years, Kibbutz Nir Oz, was rendered uninhabitable by terrorists and rampaging mobs from Gaza. As is well known now, more than 25% of my community were either murdered or taken captive that day. I am speaking here only by pure luck that I was not on Nir Oz that day. I surely would not have survived. October 7th, I was, as luck would have it, on my way to an academic workshop in Baltimore that morning, and heard about it by phone as it was happening, in communication with my family. But that is not why I'm here today. I'm here today more specifically because that Black Saturday thrust me into the practice of informal diplomacy and transnational advocacy. As some in the room know, there is a tremendous irony in all of that, because as I mentioned before, I had invested about 20 years of my time and energy studying exactly this as a historian of the modern era. But before we get to that part of it, I want to share with you a little bit, because it's just necessary, how this all began. This intersection of scholarship with the real world as it unfolded as of October 7th. Kibbutz Nir Oz, for those of you who don't know where it is, it's on the border. My home, Ben visited with me some time ago, could see the towns of Abbasan and Ichsa in the Gaza Strip from my home. Those were the two towns from which approximately 2 to 300 terrorists, heavily armed, well-trained, descended on our home, along with probably around 1,000 looters, mostly unarmed, but some with. And so you can see a very precarious place to begin with. This is how it all began in 1955. Kibbutz Nir Oz eventually would become a kind of paradise in the desert. Almost all of the kibbutzim in that area, called the Gaza envelope, were created around the same time, mid-1950s, at the time specifically to create a human border with the Gaza Strip, at the time controlled by Egypt, to keep as a human border, both for farming purposes, but also as a kind of bulwark against infiltrations by Fadaim terrorists from the Gaza Strip into Israel. In the meantime, it became a kind of manifestation of what Ben Gurion had dreamed for the Zionists in the room, a kind of blooming of the desert. This photo, and this, of course, where are we? Oh, this is the kibbutz itself, this green area, all of the fields around them, highly intensive farming, and that is the Gaza Strip right there. So up all within eye shot. Just a picture of, I'm gonna go back. Sorry. Yeah, just a typical picture of potato harvesting along the border. For those of you who don't recognize a potato harvester when you see one. That's the good news. The bad news is most of the people pictured here, you wouldn't know this, were murdered on October 7th or taken hostage and did return. Again, an aerial shot 2019, about the time that Ben was there. About 400 people lived here in the residential community. we had been subject since 2008 with Hamas's takeover of the Gaza Strip, a putsch against the Palestinian Authority. We had been subject to a lot of bombardments from the Gaza Strip. It became just part of our lives. Here you see the former UN General Secretary going through an attack tunnel that led towards my kibbutz in 2014. Just so you know it's real and I'm not making it up, that's me coming out of the same tunnel a few months before. The tunnel had been discovered before Operation Protective Edge. This was the scene on October 7th, taken from a kibbutz slightly to the east of Nir Oz that was attacked, but the attackers were repulsed. The kibbutz going up in flames. That was the last image that my son saw as he was being taken into captivity with another 76 members and residents of our kibbutz. So of the 250 hostages, 76 were from Nir Oz. And this is what remains of Nir Oz after the destruction, the physical destruction of the place. 80% of the buildings on Nir Oz need to be demolished. They cannot be re-inhabited. So for all intents and purposes, we were ground zero for the attacks on October 7th. This is the day that Sagui came home. He is the third from the left. As it turns out, the 3 young men who were released were all from Nir Oz that day. As a kind of gathering of the exiles, the one on the left, Yair Horn, from Argentina. Sagui, as you can probably guess, is a dual US citizen. And the young man on the right, Sasha Trupanov, is a dual national Russian Israeli. So that was the day of their release and these horrific ceremonies that Hamas orchestrated. Sagui was forced, of course, like everyone else, to say a few words. But yet here we are. This was Passover of 2025. As you can see, Sagui is home with his wonderful wife and now 3 daughters. So that's the lasting image for me, where I'll leave the sort of blow by blow of what happened on October 7th. And I'll leave that up for a little while, at least. Today is my first formal attempt to look at this intersection of scholarship and tragedy through more analytical eyes, my professionally trained eyes. Since I began exploring informal diplomacy and transnational advocacy, I assumed, as some might have said naively, that we can learn something from the past as historians, as scholars of the humanities, and then apply those understandings toward the betterment of some corner of contemporary human experience. For the last 20 years or so, 10 years actually, I've aimed at the formulation of best practice recommendations for today's transnational activists and philanthropic practitioners based on that historical study. As a result of my own activism in these past 2 years thrust upon me on behalf of all of Israel's hostages, the 76 from Nir Oz, they're all my extended family. So their fight was my fight. I can now add practice, my own personal practice, to that theory that I had been working on, or aggregated historical study. So to marshal this vast landscape, I created case studies through which to aggregate experiences. And I launched that through really a book written by one of my mentors, the late Jonathan Frankel, who had a relationship here also with the Katz Center in its early years, about the Damascus affair. There's no quiz at the end of this, but just to give you a taste of the kind of longue durée, the long shelf life of this informal diplomacy, transnational advocacy that I've been looking at. My original project that I began 20 or so years ago was chronologically and geographically very broad, encompassing about 200 years of activism stretching from Petaluma, California. Anyone know where that is? Jewish chicken farmers in Petaluma, California, all the way to the Soviet Far East, Birobidzhan. Some of you may have heard that name before. And from Saskatchewan all the way down to Brazil. So truly a global project. Along the way, I've explored the mechanisms of mobilization and influence, political influence, that delivered support to East European and to a lesser extent to Ottoman Jews. All of this, to steal a phrase from an old friend of mine, the late Henry Feingold, is the execution of soft power. How do people, organized or working individually, how can they project soft power? No armies, no sovereignty, but have impact on real world events. And at core, I wanted to know how philanthropists and political activists in the West nudged otherwise resistant regimes towards doing the right thing on behalf of Jews, as I said, mostly in Eastern Europe, but also in the Ottoman Empire. In light of my work since October 7th, the goal has moved to merging those scholarly conclusions with lived practice to assist future activists, wherever they may be. In some things, as I said, I'm just at the beginning of this synthesis, I guess you could call it. In some things I can describe exactly, and I will give you a taste of that this evening, exactly how my previous scholarship informed my actions on behalf of Israel's hostages. But in other things, the history probably remained deeper in the background. I was doing things, without actually formulating the historical or thinking about the historical background. So going into it, what were some of my, we'll say, cornerstone understandings from the research, things that I had kind of figured out, or I thought I had figured out over those 20 years? First of all, was a shift in this kind of activism. And for those of you who don't know anything about this, and that's fine, it's from 1848. A handful of Jews in Damascus are charged with the blood libel, that they've murdered Muslim children, and they're put up to trial, and death sentences are on the horizon. And two great men of the period, Moses Montefiore and Adolphe Crémier, a Brit and a Frenchman, combined forces to try and free them, and they are successful eventually. But I did see, looking over time, this is sort of my first case study, how this transnational activism went from reactive to more proactive approaches, sort of predicting problems and solving them before they actually happen. And over time, I saw how leadership transitioned from great men, and here are some other of those great men active from the late 19th into the 20th century. Some of these names may be familiar to you. Baron de Hirsch from France, Jacob Schiff here, not native-born American, and Louis Marshall and Cyrus Adler, all of them instrumental in multiple projects that they mobilized across the seas, or advocacy and efforts on behalf of imperiled Jews of one kind or another. Then I began observing more democratized models of leadership and mass participation organizations in the Jewish world. And here, again, just a taste of it. Upper left is the convening of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, that we know today simply as the Joint, of course, which was an amalgamation of a number of different Jewish organizations, all directed towards social justice and relief of suffering Jews. On the right, the Joint, of course, still exists. On the right, this is a poster from HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, still active in New York, that, as its name suggests, active on behalf of getting, in this time, Jews out of impoverished, imperiled Jews out of Eastern Europe, settling them in the United States in relatively comfortable circumstances. Jacob Bilikoff, who intersected almost all of these organizations, but from the perspective of a social worker, right? Not a politician, not a great man by any stretch of the imagination, what we would call today a kind of professional Jew. But this was also part of the democratizing process. And here, oh, sorry. No. And here, just a sort of vignette of really middle-class Jews coming together to organize for Jewish war sufferers in Eastern Europe in an event that got the name of the No Food Dinner. It was actually quite an amazing event. Hundreds of Jews coming to, believing that they were coming to some gala and contributing money, but in the end, there was no food served by intent to make these Jews in New York feel hunger. So interesting, but we won't go any further in that. There was another evolution going from the delivery of emergency charity to ongoing relief and reconstruction of communities. So this was about human engineering. And the example that I give, and Ben Nathan's mentioned my first book, it's how Jews from New York, for the most part, organized mass agricultural resettlement of Soviet Jews in between the world wars. Complete with, this is always my favorite, John Deere tractors farming the land in Soviet-controlled Crimea and what is today southern Ukraine. So that's the map that we have. You, of course, these are just some of the colonies, Jewish colonies that were established, again, for reconstruction, to create new lives for imperiled Soviet Jews. And also coming closer to living memory, the Soviet Jewry movement. I was a little young, but some in the audience may have living memory of the Soviet Jewry movement in the United States, North America, Britain, Italy, Argentina. This was a mass participation movement here in the West to help get Soviet Jews out of danger. That's what was thought at the time in various ways. And here there's sort of a combination of things. Just one of the classic posters that I remember from my synagogue, actually, in Connecticut, let my people go. That was sort of the motto of the movement for well over 20 years. On the right, no, sorry. These fingers are for repairing tractors and machines, not for this little thing. Here on the right are 3 members of Congress, 2 senators, 1 representative. The names may spark some memory amongst you. These guys were instrumental in passing, for the first time in the history of the US Congress, acts that tied human rights to trade agreements in the Jackson-Vanik and the Adlai-Stevenson amendments to the Trade Act with Russia from 1832. They tied it, when it had to be renewed in 1974, to Soviet behavior towards Soviet Jews. It was a first in the history of the United States. So there is that political motivation of advocacy from mass movements that actually matter. That's one way of performing, right, advocacy. The other way is from here, which you probably don't recognize, but in England, there was a parallel Soviet Jewry movement called the 35s. The 35s were a group of, it was founded as a mass participation movement, very loud, very effective, because it was led by a woman, Doreen Gainsford, who came from the PR field. She understood how to connect with public opinion in Britain. It was called the 35s because it was founded by 35 housewives. It eventually became a mass participation organization, and they led their struggle in the streets, less in parliament, but to try to impact policy by public protesting in the street. And another unmistakable shift in advocacy, in transnational advocacy, was a migration of the geographic center of all this from Europe, from Berlin, Paris, London, to New York in the early decades of the 20th century. So moving forward to October 2023, that meant for me almost immediately that there was never any doubt that the center of the campaign had to be in DC, in Washington, DC, not in Jerusalem, as strange as that might sound. And I'll try to describe that a little bit, the why in a little bit. More generally, the combination of these transitions that I just listed in the history of Jewish informal diplomacy and transnational advocacy gave me faith in that soft transnational power of ground-up activism. We had the power, these 250 families, along with others, could do something profound on behalf of our hostages, of our loved ones. I knew that we had to benefit from existing organizations and real political centers of power, but we had a really, really important role as hostage families to play on the international stage. I guess the connecting tissue, for me at least, between scholarship and what came starting on October 7th was an initial attempt on my part to programmatically convince colleagues and others that what I had learned about over many years, agricultural resettlement of imperiled communities, could work wide scale today, not for Jews, but for refugees of the Arab Spring primarily. It was published in 2020, so I didn't know about the mass Ukrainian exodus following Russia's invasion in February 22. It would apply just the same. And here I programmatically set out how it could be done. It actually got some traction, but then COVID happened and nobody remembered pretty much anything. But again, programmatically, I was already thinking in those terms, how to mobilize what we know as scholars, what we learned, each of us, into on-the-ground action that actually helps someone, and not just our CV or our ongoing list of publications. Sorry, don't mean to offend, but that's where my head is at. A more obscure understanding from the past is the importance of relations with indigenous communities wherever one is assisting a target community. So how did that play out in our case in the hostage campaign? Well, connecting with the natives, so to speak. What did that mean in DC? It turns out, I didn't know this in advance, there are some really important institutions, mostly in DC, that are dedicated entirely to hostage rescue. And with names like the Foley Foundation, the McCain Institute, not household names, but very, very well-networked organizations that helped us in lobbying politicians of all kinds, especially those who were not our natural allies in this cause. So I can tell you, this may or may not surprise people, of the, I believe, hundreds of meetings that I had on Capitol Hill, two of the most, I would say, enjoyable and truly empathetic meetings that I had were with Rashida Tlaib, who I met multiple times, and Omar Ilan, she and her staff. That is one of the prescriptions for successful, what I learned is successful transnational advocacy, and we'll see a little more of that moving on. This kind of outreach accomplished three things. A, it made our appeal more universal, speaking the language, so to speak, of the locals. It helped me understand the wider political context in which we had to advocate for the hostages across the aisle with institutions that exist already, that we have to make ourselves relevant to those institutions. And to understand, and perhaps this is the Jew and the elephant, the Jew and the elephant paradigm, to understand that we as hostage families from Israel, 250 of us or so at the beginning, that number went down over time, thank God, the treatment that we were receiving in DC by the US government, the administrations, and that's plural, administrations and by Congress was far better than almost any other group of hostages, U.S. hostages, or illegally detained citizens, people detained in Iran, in Russia, in the Emirates. We were in a far better position. And we had far greater access than anyone else. And we had to understand that in order to interact properly with the same senior administration officials and congresspeople that Ben mentioned. The history, the aggregated history, also demonstrated to me the importance of a holistic approach to advocacy. What do I mean? It's not just about dealing with elected politicians. It also includes understanding the media landscape and the financial aspects of a crisis, Hamas funding, for example, and approaching that as a sub-goal of our campaign for the hostages. In this case, as you can see here, our campaign gave us eventually access to the White House and to the Oval Office. This was our first meeting, hostage families, U.S. citizen hostage families. This was our first meeting with President Biden and his senior staff. Sitting around the table were Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and the chief negotiator Brett McGurk. We ultimately met with heads of CIA, senior members of the Defense Department, and so on, Attorney General, and so forth. It might seem obvious, but the history also suggested that a key to effective advocacy is finding a way to not waste resources. You know, whether we're talking about those great men or the more democratized version of advocacy and philanthropy, figuring out a way to economize on what you do, because there aren't limitless resources. I figured that there were already enough people focused on the campaign in Israel. And as you probably all saw, mass demonstrations in Israel began almost immediately in the streets. Translating that to the United States, you know, up to 40 million people in the street every week. Think about that in the United States. Sadly, it did not change our government policy in Israel even a little, but I believe it had some intrinsic value. And I realized that my comparative advantage in any kind of work like this was as a U.S. citizen, knowing something about this history, but also understanding pretty deeply U.S. society and Israeli society, having been brought up here in the United States. The history repeated, and for those who are wondering, the lady on the right, who is my wife and my most important thought partner in working through all of this. The history that I've been studying repeatedly showed that multiplying one's power necessitates strategic partnerships and coordination. So in the past, the Joint Distribution Committee cooperated in many of the projects that I showed you before with the Jewish Colonization Association, that's the Baron de Hirsch, with ORT, which some of you probably know. And in our case, the cooperation came with the American Jewish Committee, profoundly important, the access that they gave us in DC, especially on Capitol Hill, and an ad hoc organization that will, in 5 years, I'll add them to this list, the Forum of Hostage Families, an ad hoc organization that was formed on October 8th in Tel Aviv to give support to the families of hostages, but also to advocate for hostage release around the world. Another thing that I learned, and I have to, excuse me, I have to go backwards a little bit. Just realized the mistake before. Okay. One other thing that I learned was don't let failures derail the campaign. Failures are inevitable. Historically speaking, again, there's no quiz at the end of this, the Mortara affair that's depicted here, of course, in in artistic format. It's about a child, a Jewish child who essentially was abducted by the Catholic Church and underwent a kind of forced conversion to Christianity. Eventually, that child became a priest. The same people that we saw before, Cremier and Montefiore and others, tried to campaign with the Vatican to get this child released. They failed. They failed. And the child grew up in the church, as I said, eventually becoming a priest. But even moving further forward, I mean, in more recent memory, Jewish communal organizations, some of which I've mentioned already, campaigned FDR and his administration to bomb the railroad tracks to Auschwitz. Again, unsuccessfully. There will be failures. I learned that before, and not to get too down. In our case, where were our failures? At a macro level, we completely failed with the International Committee of the Red Cross to get them to do one of two things: either demand to visit with the hostages, and if they were denied that by Hamas, which they were, to basically state that fact in public, to shame Hamas in public, that they were not given access to they did neither. We also failed with the World Health Organization for similar reasons, without going into too much detail. At a micro level, I would say I personally failed to move 3 of the 5 major Jewish organizations in the United States to issue a public statement, a clear public statement that prioritized, in terms of Jewish tradition and Jewish ethics, prioritized hostage return over any other goal. 2 of the 5 agreed, the other 5 didn't. If anyone wants to know the details, come to me later on. So what do you do in the midst of failure? You cut losses. When specific goals can't be achieved, you have to get past your anger and frustration and move your efforts to more doable advocacy work. Here's an original best practice recommendation that I was writing into a book on October 6th that transformed into applied history in, go forward, forgive me. That turned into applied history in October 23. To communicate successfully with governments and general publics, one must craft the message to the audience. For Montefiore, that meant connecting his messaging in England to the cultural priority of the civilizing mission. Right? The white man's, I'm blacking out. Thank you. Decades later, Chaim Weizmann, one of the fathers of modern Zionism, invoked British ties to biblical imagery and European liberalism on behalf of advancing Zionism and the Balfour Declaration and everything that came after that. From the 1890s until the mid-20th century, the De Hirsch Fund and Jewish Agricultural Society promoted mass Jewish agrarianization here in North America by invoking the patriotic weight of homesteading. That's how they convinced the US administration and general public that this was a good idea to settle Jews on the land here in North America. The older folks in the audience, or younger scholars perhaps, may recall that same American Soviet Jewry movement. Those organizations framed their movement as a partner in the struggle for universal human rights, not for Jewish rights, but for universal human rights of movement and religious belief, religious practice, in the shadow of the civil rights movement and anti-war movement in the United States, so that their messaging about Soviet Jewry would become more palatable. In our case, this meant helping the hostages by speaking to politicians and the viewing public through the media in terms that made sense to Americans, not the same messaging used in Israel on TV and radio. Here, speaking at the Lincoln Memorial, the fine gentleman on my left there is Dr. Arthur Caron, who's sitting with us here today, who is my old friend and the curator of the Judaica collections, for those who don't know, at UPenn, and the chief librarian at the Katz Center, who has accompanied me through much of this journey. So overall, advocacy tactics used in one's home country, in my case, Israel, aren't necessarily good in a target company, in a target country. So the heroine, or one of the heroines of the campaign in Israel, Einav Tzingauker, who some of you may recognize, lady about that tall, pencil thin, who was a very loud, I would say, aggressive voice in Israel for the hostages and had impact in terms of gathering public opinion. That approach would never work here in the United States for myriad reasons. It took me a while to convince the families, the Hostage Families Forum, of this fact, and to craft our messaging here in the United States in ways that the general public can understand and accept. It turned out that we campaigned with two separate US presidential administrations that in many respects, as you all know, could hardly been less alike. Despite their animosity, the outgoing Biden administration, the incoming Trump administration, we got them to work very closely, intimately, I would say, on behalf of the hostages between the lame duck period, between November 2024 and January 20th, 2025, even though in all other areas, they wouldn't talk to each other in terms of that 2 or 3 months of transition. I also came to understand that through scholarship, that governments don't know anything. I'm sorry, take that back. Governments, wow, Freudian, I guess. Governments don't know everything. So here I extrapolated, okay, it sounds, kind of, pedantic, but it's true. The history of philanthropy is about filling in the gaps in that government policy, government programs can't do, at least initially. Providing those programs through philanthropic funds and expertise that eventually the government will take upon itself, one would hope, or at least in cooperation. Putting new ideas into action that existing governments can't do. How did that come into play during the campaign? Well, in addition to asking nicely, and they did it, for the Trump and Biden administrations to work together on hostage release, we got the Biden team to create outreach to the 22 other governments around the world who initially had hostages taken amongst the 250. There were nationals of 22 countries, and until we suggested it, nobody thought of that, of getting all of the ambassadors together, creating statements, creating pressure points amongst, in the end, 17 of 22. 5 of the countries refused or ignored Jake Sullivan's request, but 17 did. That had an impact. In Israel, we were able to bring together all of the ambassadors of the EU countries, despite their differences, and work together with us on hostage release, on campaigning for hostage release. That's not just about public statements. That was also about working on the financials. As you may or may not know, Hamas has been extraordinarily successful in laundering money through European banks. How do you stop that, or at least try to stop it? It's through the European governments. And that effort produced some results. How did eventually Hamas get to yes in releasing batches of hostages? I think we don't yet know the entire pathology of those decisions, but I do believe that all of these were building blocks toward it. Since the Damascus affair, this is just a media exposure. Oh, wrong direction, sorry. Since the Damascus affair, knowing when, how, and why to mobilize the media. How did this manifest in the last 2 years? It's by talking to everyone in a language, both literally and more abstractly, in a language that they can understand. The campaign The international campaign began here on the top, the first international press conference in Tel Aviv on October 10th. Believe it or not, half of the press conference we did inside of bomb shelters because Tel Aviv was being shelled at that time. But it launched the media campaign. It means going to, well, it's where my wife lives in Sarasota, Florida, within a couple of weeks of October 7th, and organizing local communities. Why local communities? To put pressure on their elected officials in DC through street actions. And continuing press conferences in here and appearances in the media and on Capitol Hill. We were repeatedly told over these 2 years by the Biden and then Trump officials and other officials in Capitol Hill and DC that we were critical in keeping the pressure on them through the media mostly and our appearances on Capitol Hill. We kept this issue alive despite the fact that there were 101 other things that passed, through their or on their desks during that time. It's a kind of unrelenting pressure, and again, these are simply things that became clear to me historically, but we put them into action here. And Ben was very kind in his words. How do you keep up the energy? You keep up the energy because you realize that this is the stuff that actually matters. But it's manifest in all sorts of ways. Again, just various forms of exposure. I'm putting this up here only because I was especially appreciative. I didn't see it in real time because I was doing this interview remotely with Andrea Mitchell on MSNBC, but they put up this picture of me next to Yehia Sinwar, which I think was sort of, if I ever write an autobiography, it'll have that me and Yehia Sinwar on the cover. And one more, I believe. Yeah. And the other thing is going to platforms that you would never dream of doing, but you have to, because you have to have universal appeal. So for those of you who don't recognize, being on Fox News quite frequently, Christian Science Monitor, on a lot of Christian media in general, bottom left, some of these outlets I honestly have never heard of before, but it turns out that there's a very robust Catholic press. And so appearing there, and perhaps the pinnacle is appearing here in 2024 at CPAC with Mark Levine and his wife. For those of you who don't know who Mark Levine is, I will send you to go do your homework. But it's crossing over political spectrums because it's simply a necessity. And this was before this CPAC, anyone had any idea that Donald Trump would be reelected. Okay, but the understanding the necessity of such things. I'm imagining that we're winding down. So other things that I think are important, and then we'll move on to question and answers, I think. Keeping trust with officials. It's a hard thing to do. It's a very hard thing to do because in our case, we were a bunch of desperate families. In my case, we simply did not know from December, January of 2024, if Sagui was still alive, and if he was alive, what condition was he in? We simply had not gotten any positive confirmation beyond that. We were acting in desperation. Other families had, various forms of this kind of desperation. Desperate people tend to do desperate things and say desperate things. It was an ongoing struggle to the degree that it's possible, have everyone stay on message and, believe it or not leak things. Because in these meetings that showed you some of, there is a kind of circle of trust that if it is violated once, it's kind of gone forever. Another understanding, and you can understand this through human nature, not every advocate, this is kind of a handbook thing, not every advocate, not every person who wants to advocate for a given cause is the right person for every job. That seems so obvious, but in practice, I've found that to be perhaps one of the most difficult things to make sure happens and doesn't happen. The other is don't make enemies unnecessarily. One of the struggles in the advocacy campaign was, it's no longer, is to not vilify Qatar and Egypt and Turkey. There's plenty of reason. There was plenty of reason, and there still might be plenty of reason to vilify as advocates for the hostages those three countries for their role in the empowerment of Hamas and the arming of Hamas. Doesn't mean that other parties weren't responsible for it. Of course there were. But it was absolutely clear from the beginning that the only way that hostages were going to come out alive was through a negotiated settlement with Hamas, and that Israel would not be speaking directly with them, and probably the United States as well. We needed intermediaries. And hence it was critically important not to make, for us hostage families at least, not to make enemies of the Qataris and the Egyptians, later on, the Turks. Other means, Ben mentioned it, I won't go any further into it, covering all the bases also in sort of the op-ed landscape. A brutal landscape for any of you who have ever tried to do this. Doesn't matter how urgent the cause is, but it can be done, and its relative weight in all of this is truly profound. So finally, aggregated history demonstrated that transnational solidarity was almost always decisive for success. Transnational solidarity. Internal division can be absolutely deadly. For example, in the Soviet Jewry movement, some of you may or may not know, Philadelphia was actually quite a linchpin at the time. But during the Soviet Jewry movement, so roughly from the late 1960s through the 1980s, there was a built-in tension that weakened the movement between those usually younger advocates for Soviet Jews who saw the older groups, the more veteran groups, as totally establishment. Totally established. They called them that. Sort of these old fogies unwilling to use more aggressive tactics here in the United States to engender support for the release of Soviet Jews from the Soviet Union, and counterattacks by the veteran organizations the National Council for Soviet Jewry attacking the students, what was it called? SSSJ. Students for the Struggle for Soviet Jewry, one of the more radical organizations that did what the veterans thought were just these reckless things, locking themselves to the gates of the Soviet embassy, for example. Those divisions weakened, and so try to avoid that when possible. But nonetheless, certain things had to be done. So in our case, it was about speaking hard truths throughout this time, and still to this day, and maybe even here right now, to both Israelis and US Jews and elected representatives. It was clear that the only thing that was going to bring most of the hostages home alive, if at all, was from immense pressure from the Oval Office, whoever occupied it at any moment. That, at least to me, was completely clear. All other things were secondary. Only massive pressure from the Oval Office on who? Of course, Hamas, the intermediaries, but also on the Israeli government. Here in the United States, it was telling major Jewish organizations, in many cases, what they didn't want to hear. That our Prime Minister Netanyahu had torpedoed negotiations starting as early as the spring of 2024 for his own domestic political reasons and personal reasons. Telling U.S. Jewry, major organizations, that the current Israeli government is and still is the first in history, in Israel's history, to act against Israel's national interest. This is one man's opinion. And that at most, since October 2023, the Netanyahu government represents perhaps, maybe 40% of Israel's population, perhaps, and that's being very, very generous. This is news that these sorts of news updates are not always welcome, but absolutely necessary to keep everyone real and moving forward. It was also really important in Israel and amongst the hostage community to make sure that we didn't take sides in the US presidential elections. I think we were successful in that. I think we were successful. And finally, telling progressive Jewish organizations that were still willing to listen that the time for talking, over the last 2 years, the time for talking about a two-state solution as a condition for anything was over. It may reappear at some future date, it may, but for Israelis, even peaceniks like me, talking about the two-state solution now, having lived through October 7th, it was an absolute non-starter. If you want the easiest way to get any Israeli of any color to stop listening to you these days is to use those 3 words, two-state solution. The brain turns off. And I'll conclude what probably, or I'm sure, has been an unconventional Howard Jay Reiter Memorial Lecture. I apologize to the family if this is not quite what you expected, but nonetheless, by emphasizing to the academics in the room, whatever your stage, from BA to tenured professors to retirees, while my personal journey has been the result of tragedy, truly, please don't let that obscure my main argument this evening. We all, whether we're art historians or musicologists or what have you, I truly believe, and I think this journey has shown in a rather unique and urgent way, but in principle, it applies to everyone, that we all have the capacity and moral duty to apply our scholarly expertise, whatever it is, towards the betterment of society as a means of avoiding and then solving real world crises. So I'll end my comments with that, and I guess we will open to questions.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Esther Reed. I work at the Hillel at Rutgers University, where I know you used to teach. I'm part of the LEAP Fellowship here. I have 2 questions. You mentioned that at a certain point, or at the beginning, you didn't have any signs of life from Sagui, and I'm wondering if that changed at any point, if you ever got any information. And you also mentioned that the most impactful conversations or meetings you had with United States government officials were with Rashida Tlaib and Ilan Omar. I wonder if you could explain what it was that made that so impactful. Tell us more about that, because I want to hear more. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm not sure I use the word impactful, the descriptor impactful. I would certainly use surprising and really moving. Congressman Tlaib, and Presley as well, we met with. So, a goodly part of the so-called squad, right? In all 3 cases, we disagreed on all sorts of things. But the humanity, the ability to see both sides of the conflict, and the suffering on both sides of the conflict, and a true desire to get to a better place for both peoples was really moving for me. In the first meeting with Rashida Tlaib, my wife was with me. The 2 of them cried about the death of children. They wept together. And these weren't fake tears. And so, again, while we could absolutely disagree about the politics. At the most human level, these people are partners. I'll tell you something else about Rashida. We presented her with a photo of Sagui when we visited with her, one of the hostage photos, right? That here, basically that, the one that I was holding here. And we gave it to her and then we departed. It turns out she put it outside of her office in the same office building she has her in Congress. And it stayed there untouched until he came home, surrounded by post-its of Free Palestine and all other sorts of domestic things, hundreds of them. That poster remained untouched. Now, does that prove anything? Absolutely not. But I think it's indicative of our underestimation or our assumptions about others who appear to be completely on the other side of the equation. That's simply not what I found. And in truth, the least empathy, I won't name names, the least empathy that I found on Capitol Hill was among those who one would assume, I would have assumed, given their statements, their public statements, were the best of friends to the people of Israel. The least empathy. Your other question, signs of life. Look, all of the hostage families, those that were fortunate enough, received official or formal notifications of signs of life through the Army. And so in our case, our first and really only positive sign of life came in late November, early December 2023, with the first tranche of releases. To refresh your memory, I believe 104 hostages were released under a first negotiated settlement, women and children, by and large. Of the 104, 40 were from our kibbutz. Of those 40, a handful of women and teenagers were able to tell us that they had encountered Sagui in the tunnels under Gaza a day or two before their release. We now know that Hamas was ready to continue releasing and with negotiations in November, December 2023 to release more and more, and it was torpedoed, those negotiations. You already know who I think torpedoed it. Beyond that, we never received any positive confirmations of life. Some indications, but nothing positive. So we did not know if he had died perhaps from wounds that he had sustained. We knew that Sagui had been seriously wounded on October 7th in Nir Oz, defending his family. We didn't know if and we got confirmation of that from the released hostages, but we didn't know if he had succumbed to massive infections that we knew about, or died as other members of our kibbutz died at the hands of Hamas captors who simply executed them for whatever reason, or from friendly fire. Bombs raining down on Gaza that collapsed tunnels. We learned from Sagui that his nearest death experiences once he was captive were from the collapsing of tunnels because of Israeli bombardments, which of course were unintentional, but nonetheless risked the lives of hostages. And we know for sure that some of the hostages who didn't survive captivity were killed by Israeli bombings.
Thank you. Liz Goldhirsch-Yellen from the Goldhirsch-Yellen Foundation. So I'm interested in what you mentioned about Jewish organizations that didn't sign on to your statement. And I'm wondering how that made you feel as hostage families. And would you contrast that to previous, activism of Jewish philanthropists, like in Damascus, for example, in previous decades and centuries?
Well, thank you for the question. I can't really compare because it's apples and oranges. It's a different age. The Jewish community is very different than it was in the 1840s. What I can say in response to the first part of your question was that once a statement started to come out from two of the five organizations. I'll tell you who the two that did, is the American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League. Came out with real serious statements about this, not criticizing anyone, but that it was a Jewish prerogative to gain prisoner release that outweighed everything else. This is not some outrageous thing. It's part of Jewish tradition and has been practiced for well over 1,000 years. Pidyon Shvuim. It's an actual practice that there are fundraising mechanisms for it and advocacy mechanisms. And then subsequently, a large group of not major Jewish organizations came out. It was around Passover of 2024. And it was, it was good to know, but why was I seeking this to begin with? The 5 major Jewish organizations coming out with a clear statement would be a pressure point, certainly not something that would tip the scales, but an important pressure point on the Israeli government. Because these same major Jewish organizations provide an enormous amount of support for Israel, monetary and other political support. But 3 of them flat out refused or made excuses and didn't do it. To this day, haven't done it.
Hi, I'm Chelsea. I'm a senior at Penn. For students who are joining classes, for example, history classes that are teaching about this topic and are advocating for equally representative histories to be taught, but are met with resistance from their professors, do you have any advice for student advocates when the power dynamic is between a student and a professor?
I should probably ask Ben Nathans and Steve Weitzman to come up and respond to that. Look, professors are difficult people to begin with, by and large. I think if you have a case to make, right, about pedagogy, make the case. Don't just say, I want. It's not good enough. I want a lot of things. It's not good enough. You have to be able to make a case to your professor, to your dean, why this is factually the right thing to do. And not just, some just because of some perhaps political orientation, but that historically it's legitimate and it's lasting. It's not, the flavor of the month, that it's a lasting truth. And I would like to believe, I don't know if it's true, I would like to believe that at least your professor will really think about it then. But going at it with a megaphone is not the way to do it. Going at it with like a serious brief would be the way to do it, because what's real is real. But that challenges you to do the hard work and not just sloganeer. Okay.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm curious, from your perspective, lobbying or advocating for the cause across different administrations, previous one, current one, what has changed what have you felt changed that made the current administration succeed in releasing the hostages that the former one wasn't able, like you mentioned, like they could have done, they were in the process previously and they, for many reasons, failed?
It's a good question. Look, the Biden administration was in office when altogether about 110 hostages were released. That massive tranche at the beginning, but also individual cases that came out. 2 women, eventually 2 women, and then 2 more women, and a couple of Russians came out. So it's not that they didn't do anything; they did plenty. And I can tell you from the inside that the agreement that was negotiated and implemented in January and February of 2025, that Trump plan was written, and no one's denied this, was written pretty much by Brett McGurk, who was the chief negotiator for the Biden administration. Why was Trump able to push this through when the Biden administration, had it more or less in hand for months before. I've written about this. He simply speaks the language of the Middle East, Trump, which is brute force. Brute force. It's unfortunate. I think the same is true, within Israeli society. I'm sorry to say. Far too often, things only move in Israeli society in good directions, forget about the bad directions, through brute force, and not sort of rational negotiation, interest-based, humanitarian-based negotiations, but brute force. So Trump came into it speaking that language. I think that's the key, and also the blurring of lines between policy and finances, because that is the language of the Middle East. That the Biden administration would either not want to do on principle, or simply didn't have the tools by which to move that forward. So my son is free today, raising his family because of that, we'll call it added value in the Trump administration. And for that, I can only give thanks. The last of Nir Oz's hostages was returned, and we buried him about 2.5 weeks ago. So the last of the 76 were returned. And again, it was done, that second agreement, the new Trump plan, is a product of that very unconventional mix of policy with financial interests. Very typical of the Middle East.
Hi, my name is Gideon Ellen Reiter. I'm Howard's daughter. And I have two questions. The first is I noticed that you are still wearing the yellow pin, and I've seen some other people in the audience wearing similar symbols. As I understand it now, there's only 3 hostages remaining in Gaza. What do you think is the meaning of continuing to wear these symbols and these signs and having this movement live on? Do you see people still holding them, and do you see what is the utility of that? To what ends?
Okay. Yeah, look, for 70% by polling, 70% of all Israelis believe that getting all of the hostages home is a mission of the highest national priority. We cannot be complete again. We cannot heal as a society, begin to heal as a society, until everyone is home. I know that sounds a little strange, perhaps, especially because we've known now for weeks that the only hostages remaining are deceased. And in that, Israel is fairly unique. Israeli society is fairly unique in the world, that it is as important to bring home a living captive as a deceased one. That's tradition, and I think it's just a moral stance. I can tell you it was, for me, I don't know about equally, but profoundly important. Of course that I bring my son home and the other living hostages, but it was profoundly important to bring, I'm just going to mention a name, Tamir Adar home. The name probably doesn't mean anything to you. Tamir Adar was, he's 40 years old. Well, he was 38 at the time, who I helped bring him up. I've been friends with his parents for 45 years. He died trying to defend the kibbutz. He has a wife, now a widow, and 2 young children. I had to bring him, I felt, in all his risk, I have to bring him home so that his family can mourn him properly and that he be buried in the kibbutz cemetery and not lost to time in some hole in the ground in Gaza. There's no rational answer to your question, but that is the answer.
within Israel to return living and the deceased remains of Palestinians who are held by Israel without due process. Do you think that these are linked and there's any hope for such a coalition?
You're not going to like my answer. Probably not, because those who are held in Israel in administrative detention are at least accused of some kind of terrorist act. It's apples and oranges. The people who were taken captive, the soldiers are all home. So whoever is left are civilians. In any case, they were taken under profoundly different circumstances. I do hope, in a broader answer to your question, and not just about Palestinian prisoners, I do pray that this so-called Trump plan, and it got an endorsement yesterday from the UN, which was a nice surprise, will usher in a new chapter. It has potential. It has potential. I think underlying or overarching above or below all of this is how do we in the region, whatever the intentions of the US administration and all of the contributing countries, how do we diffuse hatred, multi-generational hatred? I know we have to do that if there's any hope. It's not just about, the Qataris or the Emiratis rebuilding a hospital in Gaza. It's about how do we figure out on both sides how to diffuse hatred. And at this point, I'm not sure I know how to do that. Look, I'll just give you, so you understand, this is the truth. I can cry and have immense empathy for the people of Gaza, for the civilians who were just as captive to Hamas as our people were. Not quite, but very close. At the same time, that as part of the spearhead of the Israeli peace movement, since I went to Israel in 1981, I don't know what to do now, because in my home, again, I wasn't there, I just saw the results and I'm living the results. Yes, 200, 300 heavily armed, well-trained butchers came from Hamas, but they did exactly what they thought they would do. My problem is with the 1,000 looters who came, from grannies all the way down to little children, who came to loot, burn, murder, rape, and take captive anyone and anything that they could. I don't know what to do with that in terms of looking into the future. And this is from the hardest core peacenik that you could rationally find in Israel. I just don't know what to do. So we're in a real dilemma.